Welcome, everyone. We're super excited to have Tim, Jordan, and Jesse from the Headway development team to talk about Phoenix LiveView. So a basic introduction to how it all works and what it can look like to get started with it. But before we get started, just want to do a couple of things. If you're joining us today on YouTube, be sure you say hello and introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know where you're watching from, what you're working on, maybe what your role is, or maybe what you're hoping to learn today. And as we go along, be sure to put your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them along the way or at the end of the conversation. And as a reminder, this will be recorded and we might edit it a little bit, but we'll put it up back on YouTube after today, so you'll be able to watch it. So be sure to subscribe to get updates on that and other development content. We're leaning more into a full stack approach versus in the past, a lot of our events were about React, JS. And now we're going to be leaning more into like Elixir and no code and just more of a breadth of what we're working on at Headway and how you can apply that to your projects. And after today, if you have any other questions, feel free to shoot us an email at ahoy@headway.io. All right, we can go over that next slide. Awesome. And just one more thing too, if you're wondering who is Headway, if this is your first time, interacting with us and our team, we're a venture studio for hire. We help founders launch and grow, SaaS startups. And we do that through business and product strategy, design, and software development. All right, hand it over to Tim and do some intros before they dive into the content.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. And thanks for joining us, everybody. We're looking forward to presenting some intro to LiveView today. A little bit about myself. So I've been a development lead, or I currently am a development lead with Headway. I've been a senior developer for almost 5 years now with the team, and been able to work on a variety of projects from Rails full stack applications to React for the web, some React Native, more recently Elixir and LiveView. It's just been a fantastic experience. A little bit of fun fact, currently renovating an old family farm home near where I grew up, and wife and kids were enjoying it. It's been a fun challenge. Yeah, it's a delight to see that old house come back to life. And yeah, once drove nonstop with a friend from Alaska. If you're thinking of doing it, it's about 70 hours worth of driving. So it's worth every mile, but that's it. Jordan, are you up?
Is it really worth every mile, Tim?
It is, especially when you see the northern lights in the middle of nowhere,
that's fair.
in the middle of the night. That's pretty great.
That's fair. Hey, everyone. I'm Jordan Burke. I am based down here in Athens, Georgia. I have been a senior developer with Headway for a little over 2 years now. Most of my background, at least until the past year or so, has been Rails development. Rails is my first love, but I have come to appreciate Elixir and Phoenix and LiveView, and it's been fun getting to learn it and see how incredibly different it is from Rails, but also how similar in certain ways it is. And yes, I am a little bit of a Star Wars fan, if you notice the background. And I will pass it off to Jesse.
Thanks, Jordan. Hi, everyone. I'm Jesse Hixson. I'm a senior developer at Headway as well. I'm relatively new to the team, started over the summer, but really enjoying my my position so far. My background is, kind of a full stack developer. I've been, involved in front end for a long time, doing marketing, websites, and application development. Also started in Rails. Really loved that at first, but gradually started to move more towards Elixir and Phoenix, where it seems there's some real advantages there that we'll get into a little bit in this talk, and really enjoying working with that in a more full-time basis. I am from outside of Pittsburgh. I live in the suburbs with my wife and son, and in my spare time, love to just discover new music, all kinds. Just kind of trying to find the right mood when you're programming. It's always a different thing, whether it's metal or electronic or bluegrass. Whatever. Sometimes it just fits the mood. So that's what I like to do. So yeah, why don't we kick it off?
All right, so I'm going to kick things off a little bit with talking about what is Phoenix and what is LiveView from a high-level perspective, and give you a little bit of context as to what we'll be talking about today. If you didn't laugh at that pun, hopefully you will later. So Elixir is, or Phoenix is the web framework that was developed by Chris McCord for the Elixir language, which runs on the Erlang VM. It was developed initially about 2014. It's had a long and winding path to get to where it is today. Chris started developing on LiveView and released the first version in 2018. And we're seeing new improvements to it every single day. It seems like that could just be from a newcomer's perspective, but it's in active development, and it's really exciting to see how it's progressing and all of the cool things that we're going to be able to do with it. But to give you a little bit of background of how we got there, LiveView being a kind of a real-time web application platform, it started back with Chris being a Rails developer, and it seems that's a pretty common path for a lot of folks to go from Rails to Elixir and Phoenix and eventually potentially into LiveView. But he created a library called SyncRB, which basically posited the question, what if instead of render in Rails, we used something like sync, and used WebSockets to basically take a socket from the client to the Rails server, update the data, and then push the entire re-rendered template back into the client. And it worked. For those Ruby developers who come across the stream, we all know that concurrency and WebSockets and Ruby, especially around 2013, was an adventure for sure. So he searched for other potential languages that could solve this problem a little bit better, and came across Elixir and started building Phoenix on top of that, initially beginning with a high-level abstraction called channels. Channels is typically executed over WebSockets, but it's a transport agnostic protocol, which basically facilitates messages from clients and servers, multiple clients, multiple servers at the same time, allowing for kind of horizontal scaling as well as vertical scaling. And it took advantage of a lot of Erlang processes, basically to get this kind of functionality, which allows, updates to kind of propagate client and server side to, basically everyone virtually at the same time. And with that, that's the messaging part of it. And then he developed something called presence, which kind of tackles who's currently online right now, what server is online, what clients are online, what devices are online. And presence has grown into a library that really helps with IoT devices. If you're tracking things like physical objects, cars, trucks on the road, or in a chat application, like literally who is online right now. And all of these things kind of led into building out LiveView, which as a kind of a real-time platform for Phoenix, basically allowed the development of a stateful UI. So it aimed at replacing the number of SPA libraries that we end up having to use to build a front end for a Phoenix application, or really any web application, but in this particular case, a Phoenix web application. And since the launch of LiveView, several improvements have been made in terms of creating smaller diffs to update the UI, reference locking, ref locking to prevent broken UI states, so there's not race conditions between someone's updating something over here, it doesn't break the UI over here, and then improved navigation over WebSockets with the push state API, so you don't lose your history as you're navigating around in a LiveView app. So some of the problems that LiveView solves, complexity, like you're working primarily with Elixir. So if you're an Elixir developer, you don't have to know a lot of JavaScript to get into it. And that sounds, yeah, I'm going to bang on JavaScript. That sounds great, right? But some of the challenges that it still has to overcome, like there are no offline capabilities. If you get disconnected, like there's not a whole lot you can do about that yet. And of course, there are alternatives to LiveView. You've got your React, you've got Vue. You can build your SPA application. JS isn't going anywhere as much as we like to fight with it, or coerce it to do what we want it to do. And then there have, in the past couple of years, have been a push towards what Chris McCord calls other live app frameworks. Hotwire for Rails, which HTML over the wire. There's LiveWire for Laravel. So a lot of these web frameworks are developing their own kind of live state framework for their web applications. So we're seeing kind of a renaissance around this, and it's going to be very interesting to see where it comes in the next couple of years. And with that, I will pass it over to Jesse.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Yeah, that's a great introduction to LiveView and kind of the history of it and how it's gotten to where it's at today. So what I wanted to talk about briefly was just kind of how the architecture of a LiveView application is a little bit different than a traditional MVC application. So in my mind, I think it's helpful to think of how you might structure a traditional app in Rails or Laravel or even Phoenix if you're not using LiveView. So a typical kind of request response lifecycle might look something like this, where the client makes a request to your application. It comes into a routing layer. The router then decides, what am I supposed to do with this request? Is it valid? Pass it potentially, amongst some middleware, maybe for some authentication, other validation layers. Ultimately, hand that off to a controller, which is sort of the brains of the operation in those traditional applications. So a controller is going to perform your business logic, talk to a model, and in Phoenix we call that a context. It's the collection of functions that sort of perform those operations based on your business logic there, and that will a lot of times talk to a data layer, get some data from your database, maybe talk to a third-party API, assemble that all together and get it ready for the view layer. So your controller is going to structure that in a way that your view can understand, pass that along to your view layer. Your view layer then is going to determine, do I need to return this data as an HTML template, maybe a JSON payload, but it's going to inject those pieces of data back into the template that it decides is appropriate, and then finally send that response back to the client. And that's going to be the typical cycle for any request that's made to your application. So if you're clicking on a link to get to a new page, submitting a form, each one of those requests kind of has to go through that complete cycle of that. Contrasting that with the LiveView app flow. So there's some similar bits here, but you'll see there are some differences as well. So the first stop on the request is the same here in this case, in which it hits the routing layer. Again, your router is going to determine what to do with this request. In the case of a LiveView application, it's actually going to pass that on to a separate process that LiveView has created. And LiveView in this case kind of steps in as almost like the controller and the view layer. So it's going to do your business logic. It's going to talk to your context to get the data. It might talk to APIs to fetch that data and bring it back. And then it's going to assemble that data and also ultimately also be responsible for rendering out the views back to the client. So on the first cycle through this path, the LiveView is going to call a mount callback, which is going to do that action where it's fetching your data, assembling it into a view, and push that rendered template back to the client, almost in the same way as the traditional workflow works. The difference here is that the LiveView process is also going to set up a stateful connection with the client through WebSocket. So after that initial payload is received, now the client can talk to the LiveView process essentially directly, sending events, right to the back end and receiving that data response, without any of that in it, a cycle through from the traditional app flow. So you have, in effect, a direct connection to your back end, a lot more efficient and a lot simpler, really, to communicate.
Jesse, in those messages, well, maybe you're getting to it in this flow. I'll wait a minute to talk about
Sure.
what those messages look like.
Sure. Yeah. So kind of just to talk a little bit about, what does the event lifecycle look like when you're trying to communicate directly with the LiveView process. So in Phoenix, there are special bindings that, if you've worked in frameworks like Vue or Svelte, you kind of see some of these extra attributes being attached to HTML elements. In the Phoenix world, we have these special bindings called, they're prefixed with PHX. So you have things like PHX click, PHX change, submit, things like that. And those are all designed to send events directly to your LiveView process in the backend. So in this case, you might have a list of items on your page and potentially a button or a link to toggle them on or off. You're indicating in your UI that this is a special binding designed to send an event directly to your LiveView process. In the back end, you have a handle event callback which receives that event. So you can match on the name of the event that you're sending, and you can also send different parameters from your UI. So if you need to send extra data to the event processing, you can do that as well. So LiveView will match on that handle event callback based on the event that you're sending. And then again, this is now where it kind of gets into the realm of acting like a controller action. So you're essentially here performing business logic, determining what to do with that event, and ultimately, packaging up new data to be sent back to the client. And this is also kind of feels similar to React and libraries like that, where when you're updating your socket values, it kind of triggers a re-render as if you were updating state in React. So this tells LiveView, I need to re-render my templates and send those back to the client. But what's great about LiveView is it's extremely efficient at determining what's changed in your template. So you may have a page that you've logged into. It has your name, potentially lists out items that are in your application. If you've changed just one of those items, it's only going to push back the changes to your client for that particular item. It's not going to need to send data back about anything else that hasn't changed. So the WebSocket payloads that are coming back to the client are potentially extremely small, and it makes the diffing and the patching of the DOM extremely efficient. So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Jordan mentioned these points too about what makes this so great. Is you have these really small payloads that are coming across the network, so fast responses, fast exchanges of data between the client and the server, quick diffing and patching, and then you get that kind of instant single page application feel. But as Jordan mentioned, you're working all within Phoenix, all within Elixir. There's kind of no mental switching between, I need to go back to React, I need to get into TypeScript, I need to figure out my GraphQL, content types or resolvers. There's none of that extra mental overhead. You're kind of just saying this event matches and maps directly to this function on my backend. It performs these changes and sends them back through. It's kind of a in my mind, the mental overhead is a lot smaller. So, yeah, that's those. It's kind of like the bandwidth both on the network and on your brain. You kind of get both sides of the benefit there. So yeah, now I'll hand it over to Tim, who can talk a little bit about kind of how you get started in LiveView and sort of also how to decompose an existing app design into LiveView components.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. That was really helpful. And thanks for trying to reference how LiveView makes for those messages back and forth, server to client, efficient. That's one of the one of the major pieces that appeals to me is the ability to take away layers, like multiple layers from the stack of a web application, and generally simplify the build and the maintenance, and it makes for a pleasurable experience in creating and then maintaining a simpler stack. Okay, so yeah, so like Jesse said, we'll be taking a look at taking a design that we have internally at Headway for an application. We're going to take a look at this, and we're going to try to decompose this design specification down into what, excuse me, what a LiveView application would be in order to deliver this experience in this design. We're not going to get through this entire build today. We're going to focus on one very specific element, one very specific component within this design. So I see, Max, your question is a good one. Are there real examples using LiveView except to-do lists and tic-tac-toe? Well, this is probably more akin to a to-do list. So I'd like to say we have an exception to that observation, but it's a fairly complicated design. So I hope that there's still some information that you can glean from this as an exhibit. What I've seen so far, I think what we've seen is people are using LiveView for a lot of internal apps. It's a little bit safer to build an internal app to vet the technology, to grow in knowledge and just build confidence that it is an architecture that they would then use to build a customer-facing application with. So I know that there are apps being built. A lot of them are internal, so you know, unfortunately, you might not be able to see them out in the wild. With that said, though I don't know off the top of my head what apps are out there for us to look at, which are LiveView, public-facing LiveView apps, I'm fairly certain they're out there. Well, I guess there was the one, Jordan, that we saw at Elixir Conf, which was Bike Brigade, right? So there was a shout out to Bike Brigade. They have a very unique not-for-profit system in Toronto where they're delivering food, and the application, the LiveView application, is facilitating destination and deliverers on bicycles. It's a very innovative solution, and LiveView was a big part of making that system happen and establishing it. So that's one, Bike Brigade, you could look up. But thanks.
Yeah, and on the Phoenix official website, there's a pretty interesting just demo of Chris, the creator of Phoenix that Jordan mentioned. He builds out a Twitter clone in just 15 minutes. I mean, it's obviously a little bit of a contrived example. It also gives you kind of just some insight on how you can have kind of real-time communication and things between browsers and things like that. So it's also a pretty interesting just little exercise and things you can build there. So I'll post a link to that as well.
Great, thanks, Jesse. Okay, so we'll come back now to our exhibit here, our application. So what this is a tool that we are on the verge of using, which will help us facilitate project work. So we like to work and plan our work as a development team and also as design by avoiding a flat list of tasks, a flat backlog, and we try to spread that out in the form of user stories and user story mapping. This tool, this design helps facilitate that, where we're breaking that flat list down into a two-dimensional list. And what you see if you read from the top to bottom, you'll see there's epics, there's big stories, big groups of stories that we're designing and building for the client. Those big groups then are broken down into more specific flows, and those flows can be seen by the orange card, second row. And then within each of those rows, then you have individual stories, specific bits of work that we are tracking and actively working on. And one of the main benefits to this design and this tool is we can take those stories and we can reinforce that this story in and of itself may not accomplish much, but in the context of this flow and this epic, we're building value for the customer. We're building a thing that's going to be used and it's going to solve a particular problem. And then because we're reinforcing that reality, that goal, let's make sure we solve the right problem. Then we can facilitate what the priority is, and we can drag those cards and organize them in the form of a release, which you can see the horizontal break, the full width break. Actually, Jordan, if you jump to the next screen, it might be a little bit easier to see. How about one more? Okay, so here you can see a little bit more the red boxes call out the various pieces. And so again, we've got a main goal, the blue, we've got a step, a particular user flow in the peach color, the orange color, the release, which is the full width row, and then under that release, you've got individual user stories that are the actual bits of work that we work on. So, okay, so that's the highest level design. You can look at that and begin to see how cards have titles, goals, steps, cards, releases. They all have titles. You can see that if a specific user story has a status and an estimate, it has a collection of tags, it has an assignee, who's the person that's working on it, who's responsible for it. You can see within releases, the information within that release is aggregated up to tell you how many points, right, or how many hours, whatever your unit of measurement is. How big is that release based on the estimates provided per story. There's a lot of information that helps inform what we would do as a team, as a product team, helps inform our next 2-week effort. Okay, so Jordan, could you go back and we'll just call out, yeah, thank you. Call out those 5 different resources. Now there's more that would be needed to finish this entire design, this entire product, but these are the 5 main pieces that at least that we're going to focus on today. We've got the highest level is a project. So we've got a table that's going to have to track any number of projects that are actively going on within the platform. And then a project is going to have 1 or more goals. A goal is going to have 1 or more steps within it. Steps then are going to have 1 or more stories within it. Additionally, a story might only be tied to a project. It may not be yet scheduled or organized within a particular user flow, which is why we've got that relationship between project and story directly. Additionally, then a project can have 1 or more releases, and stories then may or may not be assigned to a release. They may or not be scheduled for a release. So this is just meant to be a quick call out of the different resources that are going to be needed to build out this design, how they relate to one another, and these would be the 5 resource names that I'll use going forward as we start to break down the design into LiveView components. So, okay, thanks, Jordan. We can move on here. So let's stay here for just a moment. So using that knowledge, those resource names, we start to think about, okay, how do we break apart this design into state management? What component needs to know of other components? How do they relate to one another? Which, within that organizational structure, which components are responsible for what piece of data? Similar questions that you ask when you're organizing a React application, for example. the way that I've broken this down is I want to start with a board, a project board. Coincidentally, if you read the hex docs regarding LiveView, the documentation for LiveView, a lot of the same examples they use is very similar to this. If you read, you'll see references to board and cards. This hopefully will help bring that documentation to life, because the documentation is very well written. It's very, very helpful. I'd encourage you to dig into it. Hopefully this will help create a little bit more visual for you as you read the docs, and they'll complement one another well. Okay, so back to the design. So we've got a project board. That's going to be our live view. So that live view is going to have two routes for now. There's going to be a route that gives us a list of projects, and then a route which allows us to go in and view a specific project and its related stories. That's what we're going to try to get through before our time is up today. Okay, so that project live view then has need for 1, 2, 3, 4 different live components. So there's just recently there's a new templating language, Hex, H-E-E-X, that's been introduced to LiveView, and Hex is giving us the ability to write not only a live component but a functional component. And we won't get into that difference too much, because what we need right here is primarily live components. But you can think of the differences being, one is stateful, one is managing. The live component is able to manage a specific piece of state, whereas a functional component is very helpful to organize various concerns and be responsible for pieces of markup, but it's not one that's going to have its own collection of assigns, which we'll see here in a bit as well. So just from a high level, there's a distinction to be made between LiveView, which has a specific route to it. You can think of that as a parent process. In our case, the project board. A live component, which would be a goal card, a step card, a story card, or a release. And each of those has a little bit of state that it needs to manage. And then within that, we could further decompose the design by using functional components. And so that hierarchy is very similar. It reminds me a lot of React and how I would think about breaking apart a design using a client-side application or framework like React. Okay, so then we're going to focus on story cards. So if you go to the next slide, Jordan. This is how I would break down this story card component. Again, a live component. We've got a story title. We've got 3 different selects, which is the second row, should, rejected, or 4 hours. There's a flag for now, an annotation we often would call that flag icon. We're going to leave that off for now. There's a collection then of tags, the 3rd row within the card. And then finally, that bottom row would represent assignees. So who's responsible for the particular user story. All right, so when we think about this design, again, we've got a story card, and that is going to it's going to manage a piece of state. It's going to manage a specific story. That story is going to come from the database, and it's going to be rendered as within the context of a project live view when we visit the show page for that project. We'll see when we get into actually coding this out. There's form helpers which allow us to create a text area, and then the selects that are there, should, rejected, 4 hours. Those are custom design selects, and so we're not going to get into that. Tags are again a custom custom component, a custom design, there's nothing native to the browser that would give us that, at least not one that we can use with the form helpers that Phoenix provides us. And we want to be able to do that as much as possible, use the helpers that Phoenix gives us, because it'll make for a much more maintainable application if we opt into to the patterns and the conventions of the framework than if we try to customize. Okay, and then the same could be said about the avatar at the bottom, the assignee. That's a specific component, not something that the browser just gives us natively. Okay, so Jordan, we can move on to the next one. All right, so here we're gonna take a look, and perhaps, I don't know how visible it is, Jordan, I wonder if you want to zoom in toward the top of it. Okay, thanks. So we're gonna work our way through this and see where we can get in the next 25 minutes. So far, what I've done is generated a new LiveView application, a new Phoenix application with the live flag, and that's it. So we're gonna work our way through the first couple steps here. Phoenix and LiveView guides I'd encourage you to read them. Again, the hex docs are very well written. I think you find them informative, accessible. They're just exceptional job by the community to maintain the documentation. So check out install for both Phoenix and LiveView. Like I mentioned, I've already run mix phx.new, naming the application story mapper with the live flag. So the live flag gives us some configuration within the application that supports LiveView. If I have an existing application that I want to introduce LiveView to, that's documented in the guides as well. And so it's well within the realm of possibility to upgrade an existing Phoenix app to LiveView. But because we're starting fresh, we can use the -- live to get that configuration for free. So, okay, so I'll read a little bit here before we shift over to my editor. Once we've got that application spun up, depending on how your local database is configured, you're going to have Phoenix is going to configure to use or expect to use Postgres, which you can change, you can customize that, but that's what it's going to use by default. And so you'll have to update your credentials in the config/dev.exs file to suit your environment. Once you've done that, you should be able to mix phx.server to start up your application and view it in the browser. After you've proven that it's created, the application's created, you're able to connect to the database, and you're able to view it within a browser, then that's when we're going to start to generate two things. We're going to generate a projects resource, the project board, which we talked about, and then we're also going to generate a stories context, along with defining a story component, LiveView component, live component. Okay, so let's start there. Could we switch over to the editor? Thank you. How's that for readability? If it's a little challenging to see, please leave a comment and I'll see what I can do to increase the visibility. So, okay. All right, so as I mentioned, I've spun up a new Phoenix app with the live flag enabled. Now you can see my history within the right pane of my editor, and the left pane is ready for revisions. If we look at what we get by default, you'll see a number of directories. Assets would be things like JavaScript or CSS or static files that you need to support your application. Config would be things that pertain to your overall application or your application by environment. And so the config file is shared, and then you have dev.exs, prod.exs, runtime, which is intended for build and deploy, and then test.exs. We're going to be concerned with two of these, our dev environment and test.exs, our test environment. And so, as I mentioned, you may have to edit your connection string based on your environment. For mine right now, my Postgres instance is not leveraging username and password. So I'm going to comment out those two pieces of configuration so that my repo, my database repo object, is going to give me a story mapper. Actually, let's rename this database to even keeled story mapper. It's going to connect to localhost, and there's some additional pieces of configuration which we won't get into. Okay, once I've got that configured, now if I read the instructions I was given from running Phoenix new, you can see that mix ecto.create will configure my database and create a new instance. And then from there, I'm ready to start my server. So let's try ecto.create to initialize my database based on my connection. Got to be in story mapper, mix ecto.create. And since I spun it up, it needed a minute to compile files. And okay, got confirmation the story mapper repo has been created. And now if I want to start my server to verify that it's working, I'm going to run mix phx.server. And if it's successful, we would be able to visit this at localhost 4000. And it was. So you can see that it started up fine and it's waiting for requests to come in. Because I'd have to switch back and forth between windows, I'm going to minimize the number of browser localhost screen shares that we do. But for now, we can see that it did start successfully. And I'm just going to cancel that, clear the window. And now we're ready to start building our first live view. And the first thing we're going to do is I want to call out the help that Phoenix gives us. So if I run mix help, it's going to give me a list of commands that are available to me using mix. And there's a helpful one-line description, a summary of what the command does. In this case, we're looking to generate a new live view. And if we look at this row, actually one up, this row right here, mix Phoenix gen live, that's what we need. Generates live view along with templates for that live view and a context for a resource. And so like was mentioned by Jesse, context gives us the ability to organize our code, to group related functionality into a specific module. And then that gives us a clean boundary so that people, other developers and ourselves are not mixing and matching pieces of our application that are lower. They're not quite relevant. We want to be able to group things so there's intentionality, there's guards in place, so that the API for our application is clean, it's intuitive, and not something that requires constant research and reading. All right, so let's generate this live view. We'll go mix phx gen. Actually, let me back up a second. If I run mix help on a specific command, we'll get some very helpful information about that. And so I mentioned there's a summary statement alongside each command. If you run mix help and then the command, you'll be able to get a deep dive into what that command does. So we're not going to look to customize this command. We're simply going to ask it to give us the defaults, gen live, and what we want is a context named projects. We want an ecto schema named project, We want a database table named projects. And then that database table is going to have a single field named title, a single field in addition to the primary key, and some implied timestamps that Ecto gives us out of the box. All right, so when I generate that, we now have a number of files that are created. You can see there's 12 or so files that were created, a few that were modified as indicated by the injecting label, and then some routes that it gives us that we can use to expose our live view we just generated. So we're going to take 2 of these routes. We're going to take, let's see, I'm going to copy each of these, even though we only need 2 of them for now, and then we'll come back and continue to follow the advice there of our generator. So we want to add those routes to our router.ex. And we can see right now there's currently 1 route that was generated for us when we created the Phoenix application. We're not going to need that anymore, so we'll delete that in a moment. At the root of our route tree, we want to be able to get to /projects. We're not going to create a new one. We're not going to need the new route for now. We're not going to edit either. We simply want to be able to view all projects and then view a specific project. And again, we don't need the page controller route. So these are the 2 routes. And like Jesse had explained, when an HTTP request comes in, the router is going to match on /projects, and then it's going to work on mounting in the life cycle of a live view begins. It doesn't involve a controller, although it could. It doesn't involve a view. It's giving us that live view definition whenever we visit /projects. Okay, so now we've got our routes added. We've got a migration that was created for us. Let's take a look at that. It's a projects migration. This is the definition. So again, there's a title attribute of type string, and timestamps is a helper that gives us an insertion and an updated field on each table, which is very helpful for tracking history of a particular row. Okay, and just like the instructions to migrate the database, we'll run ecto.migrate. And now we have a live view, a context, a schema, a route, all working together to expose a project's resource. And so let's update a couple other things inside the live view templates that we were given when generating the live view. There's some references to the routes which we didn't use. Those references being the new projects and the edit projects routes. We're going to remove those links just so they don't, they won't compile if we don't get them out of there. So let's edit the index.hex and show.hex files. And in fact, we're going to remove a few of these things here. So we'll remove that. And we'll remove the edit, delete, and new routes inside index. And then additionally, we're going to edit the show template. Just make it as simple as we can. We'll remove the edit link, and that now should give us the bare minimum that we need to render a project board. All right, so let's give it a try. Mix Phoenix server see if it starts up. And it does. And then let's see here. And if we switch over, thank you, Jordan or Jesse, we can see that here's our application running at /projects, which is the route we declared. And we don't have any projects in the system, so there's nothing that's going to render right now. In a moment by updating our seeds file. So let's go there next so we can actually see data rendering to screen. And if you're familiar with seeds file from Rails or from Phoenix, which is what we're using, it's a helpful utility to define data to seed your database, to hydrate your database with something that you can use for development purposes. So we're gonna start by creating a single project. And if you're familiar with Ecto, you'll recognize that I'm not using an Ecto schema, the project schema. We're just using a schemaless approach. One possible, I prefer to do that with something like a seeds file, because as that schema evolves over time, it can create conflicts with your seeds file, and there's a lot of brittleness that can come. Whereas using this approach, which is to use a schemaless file, it avoids some of that, some of those conflicts that can develop in time. So we want to insert a single row into the projects table, and that single row is going to have my first project as its title. Since we're not using an Ecto schema, we have to specify the timestamp values for the row, and we're going to use date time UTC now as our timestamp, and the same needs to be done for the updated at column. Date time UTC now, and we'll format it. And now if we save that, and I'm going to stop our server, fix ecto.reset, we'll drop the database, create, migrate, and also run our seeds file to give us a row of data. And you can see insert into projects, the value that we just typed out in our seeds file. Okay. So I'm not going to switch back to the browser just to be conscious of time and try to get further into the actual story card, which is the more interesting piece of this. But we would see this project listed. Now, what we want to be able to do is, ideally, is see project details with a list of stories within it. So could you, let's see, could we switch back to the Miro presentation and then move ahead to the last slide, Jordan? Thanks. Okay, great. So one of the benefits, one of the many benefits of LiveView that we've been finding is how much simpler it is to test the UI in combination with the back end. Trying to test a full stack application that is a SPA is very difficult. It adds there's a lot of complexity involved in that. LiveView testing finding is, it builds a lot of confidence, and it's quite accessible. The tests themselves are near instant when they run, and the helpers built around it are fantastic. And so testing is one of the major benefits when it comes to LiveView. And so to start, we're going to run our test suite and see if it still passes, because we'd made some changes to the defaults that Phoenix gave us when he generated the application. remove some routes, we remove some links. So there's some tests that may not be passing yet. And then just, you can see the diagram of what represents a test with LiveView, because as Jesse illustrated, you've got an initial mount of a LiveView. That's just static HTML, similar to a server rendered application, akin to Rails static rendering, if you're familiar with Rails. The second, so you can test that in its disconnected state. There's helpers within LiveView to do that. You can test what is rendered. You can also then test in its connected state, what are the changes that happen to the UI when interacted with. And so that's this simple diagram here illustrating the life cycle of a LiveView, and then how tests can be accomplished for both states at all pieces of the life cycle. Okay, so let's run mixed test. If we could jump back to code editor, thank you. And if you remember, I edited dev.exs, my database connection string. I did not edit test.exs. And that's still going to try to connect using these credentials. So I'm going to comment those out. And now try running mixed test and see if it is red or green. First time running, it's got to compile. I should have run that before, but be done here in a second. Okay, while that's compiling, let's take a look at the, let's see. Find the project live test. Okay, and we do indeed have some failures because of the changes we made. So because some of those are related to the page controller and the fact that I removed the route to the page controller, we're just going to ignore them for now. Some of these, though, have to do with the links that I removed, as in there's no more, let's see, there's no more delete, there's no more edit, and I suspect that's where these errors are coming from. So let's remove the tests which aren't relevant. There's no creating a new project. We're also not updating in a list, nor are we deleting. We are displaying a project. We're not updating within a modal. Okay, let's see here. Okay. Move into the right directory. Try again. Okay. So we're missing a route again, page controller. I guess let's remove that so we're not having to look at that failure. Okay, so now we're green after removing those tests and that specific controller test. Let's take a look at how these tests are structured from what we get out of a Phoenix generated project. There's a fixtures file that comes with any new context that you generate. In this case, it's named projects fixtures based on the context name. That fixture then is used to create a new record for any tests that require it. And in order to call this create project function, which again leans on project fixture, the recommended approach is to use the setup feature that comes with XUnit. So this setup create project function will be called for every example within our index describe. In this case, there's only the one. Same for describe show, where there's our single test. So the change that we want to get to is on the show page, we want to be able to see stories rendered. And so what I would do is start with adding an assertion, which we know is going to turn our green test suite into a red test suite. In which case we're going to look for a story with a title of my first user. Okay, that's what we want to see on the screen. We want to see the title of the project, and then we want to see a single story name with the title of my first user story. And if we run that, expect it to be red, in which case it is. I'll expand that a little bit so we can learn how to read the feedback that we get back from XUnit. So you can see there's a left and a right side. The left side is what was rendered by our LiveView test, by our project's LiveView. And it's a little bit hard to parse, but you can, if you read through it, you'll be able to see the text that we're looking for, and obviously we did not find, which is my first user story, as defined in our assertion on the right side of the comparison. So, all right, so we're going to see if we can get that to pass. In order to get a story rendered within a project, we need a stories resource. So let's go there next. We don't need a stories live view, but we do need a stories context. So let's generate a new context. We're going to call our context named stories, our schema named story, our database table named stories, and then the fields within that database table will have will be two. There's going to be a title of type string, and then a project ID to serve as foreign key of type integer for now. Okay, so now we've got a second resource created. It's not yet tied to a project. We're going to have to do a couple things to get there. One of those is first to revise the migration. So let's find create stories. And so by default, I specified integer for project ID. That isn't quite what we want. What we want is to use the references helper. And it's going to reference projects table, and then we want to specify a constraint within the database so that whenever a project is deleted, stories go with it. And so that option that Active Migrations provide us is on delete. We want to delete all. Okay, so let's try migrating the database accordingly. And now we got our second table. Let's take a look at the story schema. And we actually changed our project ID from type integer to be a foreign key. And so let's revise this so that a story belongs to project, and the schema for this resource can be found at storymapper.projects.project. That's the name of the module. And let's see here. I think we want to adjust our change set. So we're just going to allow for title for now as what's updated. All right, so our story schema now matches our story database table. We want to also adjust our project schema though, so that a project can pull related stories. So let's look at that next. I'll bring them up side by side so you can see the reference. Okay, so a project is going to have many stories, and story mapper dot stories dot story is the module name, and that should be what we need to begin to render related stories for a given project within our LiveView template. All right, so let's run mix test just to make sure that things are still compiling and they are where they were before we generated our context. And we have 2 additional failures, looks like. Let's see if those are relevant. Okay, so they are relevant. They're coming from stories test. And if you remember, I specified project ID as an integer. And then I went and changed that from an integer to be a reference. And so project ID is not set in these tests anymore from our fixtures file. We'll just revise those to be nil for now. So let's open up stories test to get that to pass. And let's look for project ID. Looks like here on line 24, we can remove that for a moment. Move that. Let's do the same here on line 36. Remove that for now and remove this assertion. And I believe, well, we'll remove this too as an invalid attribute. Let's try that again, mix test. And okay, so we're back to 1 failure. Let's see how we doing on time here. Okay, I know we're running a bit long, but I think it's worth trying to render stories within the context of a project before we wrap up. So let's keep going. Thanks for bearing with us as we extend this a bit. So let's go back to our projects test. And we want to come back here. This is what we want to render, my first user story again, after generating that new resource. So to get there, we need to modify our setup because a project is getting created, but there's no related story to go with it. Let's see here. Let's take a look at our projects fixture file and get a little bit more room to read here. So this is what the fixture file looks like from Phoenix. It accepts an optional collection, an optional map of attributes, merges them in with any defaults that we assign, in this case, some title, and then creates the project using the project's context. Let's take a look at the stories fixtures. And so here, the story fixture, again, sets defaults, which is what we'd expect, but we don't want project ID of 42 because that's our foreign key. So let's get rid of that. And let's see here. If we just bear with me for a moment. So let's, for the sake of time, let's count on project D of being 1 because we're always resetting the database, the table anyways, in between examples. So we're going to assume it's 1 whenever we create a new project instead of going through and correlating each record with one another. So we want to create a project, and we want to create a story in part of our setup. And what that looks like is very similar to create project. So create story. And let's see here. We need a new story using the story fixture, which we'll import here in just a moment. And then from these setup functions, we want to return a map with whatever details need to be shared with our test suite. Okay, so then we need to import, just like we do projects, stories, fixtures. And now when we go to view a project based on our test, there's 2 setup functions, create project and then create story. And we're assuming that the project ID is going to be 1 that's in the system, which will then allow it to be correlated to the story created. Additionally, we need to add a title to our story to match what we're expecting in our test assertion. So let's give it a title of my first user story. And now let's see if it builds. We're not yet rendering this in the template, so it's not going to pass. We want to run it just to make sure that we're on track here. And so it is, we're getting the same failure we were prior. Now let's look at adding the project story to the LiveView template. And let's use, here's our project live show LiveView. And you can see that to render the project details on the page, we need to assign the project so that it's exposed to the template. If we look at the template alongside the LiveView definition, show.html.hex, you can start to see how these things begin to be wired up, where we assign a project, and that project then is exposed to the template in this fashion. So add project is available to us, and we want to be able to read that. Let's see here. Let's try. Let's try that. And then, okay, so we're at this point, we're still rendering project title. We are just about to the place where we can render a story title. And we're going to expose to our template a collection of stories through assigns. I'm going to use a comprehension to do that. So a story inside our collection of stories. And let's just render those within a paragraph tag for now. Okay, now if we run our test, it's going to fail because there's not an assigns available named stories, which we can see assign at stories is not available in the template. And again, we can see when the live view renders and mounts, we can see where the assigns come from. By default, it's coming into handle param. So let's take the project that's been requested based on the query params of the route, and let's do a little bit of reorganization here. So we're going to find the project using our context, and we want to assign stories based on the project that we found and its related stories. So this is getting us close. If we run this now, we're going to see a not loaded error come back from Ecto because we didn't specify project stories should be available. And so right here, we can see the error that we're given from Ecto is that protocol enumerable wasn't implemented for an Ecto association not loaded module instance of our, what we're trying to get to is a collection of stories. So let's change that by using story mapper repo.preload. So this is going to change our not loaded message back into the actual collection of stories. Okay, so now we're back to what I think is a similar error. And let's see here. We got past our loading issue. We assign stories. We're looking to render the title within our collection of stories within our comprehension. And let's take a look at the browser and see what we get there. Jordan, would you be willing to flip over to? Thank you. So we can see my first project. If we go to view it, we still see my first project because we didn't seed the database with any stories yet. So let's do that so we can better debug our test. So back in editor, I'm going into seeds. And what we want to do is first find the project that we created. We'll just cheat and use one since there's only one in the system for the sake of time. And then we want to insert a single story related to that project into the stories table with a title of user story and a project ID of project.id at the same current time. Okay, I'll stop my server, mix ecto.reset. And it looks like that worked as expected. And now we can see that my first user story is now related to my first project. And if we go back, we're using LiveView to navigate back and forth. We'll go back to the editor. And I'm going to stop server again. Next test, reinspect the error that we're getting. Okay, let's see here. So I'm going to inspect the records in the database just to make sure that my setup is happening as I'm intending it to. I'm expecting there to be a project and a story in the database. Perhaps that's not the case, which is why we're not getting a story back rendered to us. So let's use story mapper projects.get project. Again, we're going to cheat and use the ID of 1. And then let's preload our stories relation. Using inspect, we can print out what our collection of stories within our project. We'll also print out our project just to see the details of it. If we're on mixed test. Okay, so that is why, because our project is not one. Postgres may auto increment and not reset. So we can't assume 1 is the ID, but we can make the actual assignment by using a prior setup function, the map that was assigned inside our create story setup function. So let's access that project here. And then we'll assign project ID of project.id. Still return our story, and let's see if that gives us closer, but we need to change this to project.id. Okay, if I scroll up, now we have a project, but we're still not getting any stories back from, we don't have any stories in the database, or at least not associated with our project. So let's take a look at our stories fixture. That's because we assign it here, so let's remove that. Still no, and I think that is because our story schema is not accepting, because I removed it prior, is not accepting project ID as a acceptable value. So that we have to cast that value if we try to pass it in as part of a change set. Okay, closer, very close now. Let's not require that for now. And we got it to pass. So let's go to this. And test one more time without the noise of those inspections. In our test suite runs, let's bring it up in the browser one more time. Nothing will have changed from last time we ran this. But just to prove the point. So there's my first project. Thanks, Jordan. And here's my first project with our first story. So, okay, thanks for bearing with me while we work through those failing tests. But if we go back to the editor one more time, just for a moment, the ability to set up test UI, assert UI, render a route, all within 4 lines of code is pretty enticing, given the complexity that a SPA application would introduce. The ability to keep your entire stack as concise as this single test file does is very, very appealing. So there's plenty more within our application. Jordan, if we jump back to Miro for just a moment, there's plenty more within our application that we obviously need to get to. We only have specific HTML tag rendering. We don't yet have a story card component. We don't have goals, steps, releases, but we do have the beginning of our application created. We generated a database, we identified schema, we created 2 different contexts along with the specific live view, the project's live view. And so the foundation's in place for us to be able to move much quicker and build out what would be a very interactive application. So thanks everybody for hanging in there while we work through that test suite.
Awesome, Tim. Thanks for doing some live coding and doing your best. I know it can be tough on the live stream just to make that all happen.
Yeah, thanks for your patience, everybody. Didn't intend for it to go long, but appreciate.
Is there anything else you wanted to say, Tim, Jordan, or Jesse, as we wrap up?
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Oh, that was me. Sorry, guys.
No, I think that's a wrap for me.
All right, cool. Well, I'll wrap things up here. So thanks again to Tim, Jordan, and Jesse for walking through all this today. It was super helpful for everyone watching. I'm doing a little bit of the live coding as well. This is being recorded, or this was recorded, so it'll be up on our YouTube channel within the next week. We might have some links to all the resources that were mentioned in the chat as well. And just, I just want to share a couple things. We're bringing our development podcast back to life. It's called Even Keeled. So if you go to evenkeeled.fm, you can see the some of the episodes we do have live, and then we'll be on the lookout for more episodes coming up in the near future. And if you're looking to find a new job or change up your career, maybe you want to work at a new place, we are hiring, so you can head to headway.io/careers and check out the openings we have here at Headway. Otherwise, with that, I don't have anything else to share. Thanks again for everyone for tuning in. Thanks to everyone for their questions and their feedback here in the chat. And thanks again to Tim, Jesse, and Jordan for sharing their experience and expertise. So with that, everybody have a great day, and we'll catch you next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.